Surprise! Hi patrons and members! This is an exclusive review just for you all, as I've done in the past, or maybe you're not totally aware of. If you're new here, I'd like to do, hopefully every month, at least one exclusive review alongside my early access to all my videos for my supporters, which has in the past always been on Patreon. I recently opened this up to YouTube members as well, in case everyone wanted to use that instead of Patreon. I'm working on putting all of my exclusives also on YouTube for members only, and this is my first ever exclusive Patreon and member video review. So this month, I'm currently recording this on February 13th, and for this month I put a poll out to force myself to do a comic book review and analysis, and for this month the winner of that poll, which was themed exclusively around DC events, was Final Crisis. So I have it on my tablet right here, and you can see, no, please excuse me if I look over for notes here. Right here in front of me I have not just my microphone, but I have my laptop open for my my notes for Final Crisis. I recently reread this once the poll basically was over by the time I started rereading. I wanted to get a little bit of a head start. And Final Crisis was a pretty decisive winner, I would say, for this poll. I also had Crisis on Infinite Earths, Death of Superman, and Flashpoint as the various events that we would talk about for this review. And so Final Crisis 1, obviously not too surprising for me. I kind of thought that maybe Crisis on Infinite Earths would win, but if you've been a follower of the YouTube channel for a while, I have done a lot of Grant Morrison stuff, right? So a 3-part video on Grant Morrison's Batman, a video on Flex Mentallo, and Grant's just come up a lot in different videos as I've talked about their work, obviously. Now, Grant goes by they, them pronouns mostly, so please forgive me if I ever slip, but I will be referring to Grant as they, them, as the author behind this work. Now, Final Crisis, as you can see here, was a DC event. When did Final Crisis come out? I believe it was 2008? Final Crisis. I'm looking it up now. We're doing this live. There will be very little editing during this video, only if I really need to patch some things together. So you might see me take a moment, take a breath. I have been breathing more in my videos lately to prove to people that I am absolutely not AI. I am a real person. You just don't see my face usually. 2008. So this came out in 2008, of course, for DC Comics, a 7-issue miniseries, and there were several different tie-ins also to this miniseries. Some of them are collected here. Now, this is the digital format. I don't have Final Crisis in paperback, and I wanted to re-download it, and so it's really, really cheap. If you haven't read Final Crisis, this was, I believe, $7 on what is now Kindle, as Comixology has been folded into them. Everyone has different opinions about that. So I reread this. I read Final Crisis back when it came out, and I've reread it once since then. I think I reread it as part of my research for Morrison's Batman work. So if you're not familiar with it, if you're watching this and you haven't watched those other videos or read that stuff, Morrison did a really long Batman run that kind of had some breaks in it. And there's 3 parts to Morrison's Batman run. We'll kind of jump into that just briefly here. The first part stems through most of the main Batman title, ends with Batman R.I.P. with the seeming death of Bruce Wayne, but not really, and it folds right into Final Crisis. We'll talk about it a bit. That folds into the middle portion of Final Crisis, then also issue 6, which is the second to last issue. And in that, spoilers, there's spoilers here, obviously. We're talking about something overall. This is a loose format, so there's some spoilers for Final Crisis, but don't worry about it, because this is a comic where even if you know everything that happens, it is such a strange experience for good and bad that maybe knowing what's going on actually is helpful, because even having read this several times, there were points where I was like, where am I? What's going on exactly? Why is so-and-so acting like this? Where have we jumped in time? There's a lot of time jumps and back and forth. It's kind of an important part of the story because it does deal with like space and time being fractured. But all to say, so spoilers, eventually Batman has this confrontation with Darkseid, and Darkseid is the main antagonist here, as you can see. This is one of the first interior pages. And is hit by the Omega Sanction, travels through time, and that sets up the second act of Morrison's Batman epic, which involves Batman and Robin, where Dick Grayson takes over, and we find out that Bruce Wayne is lost in time, and there's this whole miniseries called The Return of Bruce Wayne, and that eventually Bruce Wayne comes back, and we get into the final part, which is Batman Incorporated. Anyway, that's a little bit of just sort of how this ties into stuff. One of the weak parts here, this is an analysis and a review. One of the weak parts, I say, of Final Crisis is that for being this end-all, be-all epic, and there was obviously some tie-ins with this, and not only single issues meant for Final Crisis, like there's a few that are included in here, Final Crisis Submit, which I really like, and then Superman Beyond, Final Crisis Run. There's a few different ones. There's not a lot of lasting consequences, I would say, from Final Crisis. The biggest consequence, I would say, is from all the Batman stuff, which obviously Morrison had a lot of control over, and so you see that happen in those pages, and I think that it's stronger because of that. But when we jumping to the end of this, the entire universe is condensed down. It's crushed almost into a singularity around Darkseid. And I think that most of the other comics happening at the time just kind of ignored it. So this isn't like Crisis on Infinite Earths that had this massive, long-lasting consequence from it. And it's not like Infinite Crisis, where everything kind of ended up revolving around that. I think that Infinite Crisis, while I would say the event itself is good, but maybe not amazing, it's a very solid execution of an event. But it is a great example of how a larger comic company line can tie into an event and really make it feel important. And I know that's a lot of work for writers that have their own stories going on. And there's been a lot of examples over the years of writers who had something happening and they had a plot line going for a character or an arc they wanted, and then it gets totally sideswiped by an event. And comic book events used to be a rarer occurrence. They didn't happen every 6 months, right? They would happen once a year or maybe once every 3 years. And then starting in, I would say, the mid-2000s, company-wide events began happening at a really increased rate, where every 4 months something was happening, or maybe 6 months, but it would just go over and over and over. And then there would be company mandates to say, you got to tie in. We demand you stop your story and tie in. And so there's always, there's positives and negatives of that. I would say Infinite Crisis is overall, in my view, a positive. And Final Crisis is negatively affected, I would say, by its general lack of impact in the larger line. I know I'm skirting past some stuff. I'm not detailing every single thing. But when you look at the history of DC Comics, let's say we talk about, we don't look at DC Comics as a publication, but as an actual living, breathing world. And you say, if you were to talk about the history, there's certain things that would absolutely have to be talked about. You would have to say, if this was a history class on DC Comics, you would have to talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths. You would have to talk about probably, 0 Hour or something like that, and the death of Superman, and you would have to talk about Infinite Crisis. But what's funny to me is that I actually don't think that you have to talk about Final Crisis for the most part when you actually talk about the history of DC Comics, especially because this comes at a time where DC Comics is deep, 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 deep into the lore of multi-generations of heroes. There's moments where, for example, Billy Batson, Captain Marvel, or Shazam is totally missing. He's not here, and in his place is Freddie Freeman, his successor, who for a brief period of time wasn't Captain Marvel Jr., but became the one and only Captain Marvel alongside Mary Marvel, who is done absolutely dirty here and is it's really one of the weak points of this book. But as a reader, maybe then you would say, oh, I know what's going on. But if you're reading it now, you're like, when did this happen? Why is he like this? Or Aquaman, Arthur Curry was gone for a bit, and there was a new Aquaman who was very mysterious and took over and looked basically exactly like Aquaman. And Arthur Curry became some sort of weird tentacled hermit in the sea. And that's briefly talked about, but then Arthur Curry is kind of restored, but it's not really talked about. It's that sort of weird stuff sometimes where, you get these events that happen in the middle of a status quo and you work with what you've got. And sometimes it works out really well and you get all the classic incarnations of the characters. And sometimes it works out where you've got a lot of strange versions happening at the moment and you just kind of got to go with it. And that happens for every, big company that has to do these sorts of things. And you also don't want to mandate restore all the normal versions of your characters just so our comic has better name recognition. But then sometimes it gets really weird. I'm going on so many tangents here. But this is not a breakdown of every issue of every page. I don't do that. I never did that. And what we're talking about is this comic as a whole. So let me give you a little bit of a breakdown about what Final Crisis actually is and what's happening in it. So Final Crisis comes at the end of a year-long weekly comic called Countdown. Now, Countdown basically also has nothing to do with Final Crisis because previously DC had done another weekly year-long comic called 52. And 52 was a huge success and it did super well. And of course, DC editorial said, do it again. And they did this one called Countdown. And for a long time, it was just called Countdown. And it was going, instead of 1 to 52, it was counting down, I think, 52 to 1 or maybe 0. And for a long time, it was like, what's it counting down to? And eventually it was revealed that the full official title was Countdown to Final Crisis. And eventually this story goes into the multiverse. Some universes are destroyed and their Earths are like destroyed and reformatted. And you get this war of the new gods. And Orion, who's a long-standing new god hero, and Darkseid, who is our big bad, have a giant battle. And at the end, Darkseid is killed and Orion is injured. And at the very beginning of Final Crisis, he is shot and killed. So, but all that ends up not being any sort of consequence, really, because Grant also had their own ideas for where Final Crisis was going, and it fundamentally mismatched with Countdown. So it ended up not mattering, which I think frustrated a lot of people who were reading all of Countdown, and then it kind of it wasn't necessary, which is, again, important for, selling your comic. You don't want people to be like, well, I can't read this giant, big event comic that DC is counting on because I didn't read these 52 other issues. So also, I think that people didn't really like Countdown, so maybe no harm, no foul. Anyway, Final Crisis, and here we are, starts with a bit of a prelude here. I'll skip some stuff with the fall of Orion, sort of through multiple layers of the multiverse. You're probably already familiar. DC has a multiverse. At this time, it was established as there was 52 separate alternate universes. And along with that, we have the coming of this character named Libra, who is a herald sort of Darkseid. And of course, Darkseid, if you're at all familiar with DC, is the big cosmic evil, right? And there's also a tease, which we'll get to later, of the return of Barry Allen. Barry Allen now has been around for a long time, but spoilers again, Barry Allen returns in Final Crisis. And it's the first time that they are back after Barry Allen dies during Crisis on Infinite Earths. And so that's a big deal, obviously. And Barry is like dead for a long time, with some brief appearances here because of like time travel stuff. And Wally West takes over as the Flash primarily ever since then. And it's been decades. And for a long time, it seemed like Barry Allen was one of those few comic book deaths that would actually stick, especially given that Wally West became a really, really popular version of the Flash. A lot of people still cite Wally as their favorite Flash, and eventually, we won't get into it, but Barry becomes the main Flash again for a long time, and Wally's kind of set to twist in the wind. That's what happens, especially when you have legacy characters, especially with DC. DC has so many legacy characters and families of superheroes and where they go and what are we going to do with them, right? Anyway, this also has to deal a lot with the larger cosmos and timeline of DC. And what Grant does here is at the very start, you'll see, is this flashback to ancient, times, caveman times. And you get this character who is kind of obscure named Anthro. And Anthro is kind of like the first boy. A caveman, and you see him interact with this new god, Metron. Now, what I would say is, you kind of start and you're like, where's this going? Well, I would say that the first half of Final Crisis is it's a mystery. It's a detective story, and our detective is Dan Turpin. Now, Dan Turpin is a longtime Superman supporting character. You might know him from Superman the Animated Series. I love Dan Turpin in the animated series. He was done a bit as an homage to Jack Kirby at the time, and Turpin dies close to the end of it's the end of the second season of Superman the Animated Series, and a really amazing and very heartfelt story with Apocalypse and Darkseid invading and Superman being, down for the count, and Turpin takes over, but Darkseid kills him at the very end before he leaves. And it's this tragedy, and I would say it's if I'm remembering correctly, I listed Apocalypse Now, which is the two-parter then that happens in, as the best episode of Superman the Animated Series. It's really fantastic. Turpin is on the case and finds Orion, who dies from being shot with this superpowered bullet. And as we go through, we start to see all the different players of Final Crisis. Lex Luthor and his supervillain Cabal are recruited by Libra, and as proof that Libra can give them everything that they desire, and specifically this very low-ranking villain called the Human Flame, he kills Martian Manhunter, who you see right here. Martian Manhunter's ultimate weakness is fire, and so he kills him with a flaming staff, basically. It's pretty brutal, and it sort of is the first shocking, moment of Final Crisis. And it sticks for a while. I believe the Martian Manhunter's actually dead for quite a while. Dan Turpin also is on the case of these 6 missing children that seem to have powers, and it leads him to a place called Club Darkseid. And now, okay, let's talk about this for a second. And this is you see how I'm having to make so many caveats for the series already, and to sort of begin to explain everything that's happening in the series, is that several years before this, Morrison wrote a multi-part miniseries called Seven Soldiers, which was a very interesting concept for a miniseries. And in that miniseries, it's split into several different miniseries. There's like an opening issue, I believe, and a closing issue, and there's these seven different characters, and they all each get their own miniseries. And it's sort of, the idea is that it's an event comic without being an event, and that this team is a team without them ever knowing it. It's Clarion the Witch Boy and Frankenstein and several other characters that we don't need to get into. And in that, the new gods again are Darkseid and Highfather and Orion, Granny Goodness, Desaad, all these different people who you may be familiar with. There's the good side and the bad side. And they've descended to Earth and taken on human forms after this unseen war in the Fourth World. And the Fourth World being their whole, other dimension. And in that is Club Darkseid. And Darkseid is now this human crime boss, right? He's a crime boss, and he has a human form, but he still has some powers. And there's a new Mr. Miracle, all this sort of stuff. And that happened, but the thing was that there was never really any discussion about where it was in the ongoing DC continuity. It was very confusing. And then that ends up tying into this. And so somehow in this whole storyline that's happened just after Countdown and that is ongoing in the major DC universe, somehow Seven Soldiers also happened. I can't explain it. Maybe it's explained somewhere else. Maybe Grant has explained it, maybe not. Because now the new gods have fallen and Darkseid is there as boss Darkseid, and so on and so forth, as you have it. And the major thing is that, the new gods have come to Earth, especially these evil gods, right? Turpin, you can see here, maybe you can see Turpin is interacting with boss Darkseid. But his body is failing, he needs a new body, and eventually what we come to find out is that Darkseid puts his spirit into Turpin's body, and we'll go from there. We also kind of flash forward, again, there's so many things happening, to the end of time with Commandy, who's like the last boy. So you get this story kind of bookended on either side with the first boy and the last boy, and the whole larger saga of the DC universe. Again, this is called Final Crisis, and Grant is really trying to wrap everything together, as well as the monitors. Let's talk about the monitors. The monitors are, well, originally there was just the one monitor. The monitor being from Crisis on Infinite Earths, who watched over all of the multiverse and sort of, kind of like the Watcher, observed, but also made some differences. And then there's the anti-monitor that we fought against as in that whole thing. And in stories that recently happened right before this, the monitor is reborn as the monitors, and there's 52 monitors, each for their own universe. And we get this other one called Nix Wotan. I think that's how you spell it, or how you pronounce it. This is one of many comic book characters and concepts that are written, but no one ever speaks aloud. Nix Wotan wakes up as a human. He was a monitor that was banished to being a human on Earth, because of his interference with previous stories. Now, I'm just going to blaze through a lot of stuff here for the sake of, staying on track. Morrison is introducing so many concepts. We have the monitors, Nix as a human. We have, Commandy and Anthro and the New Gods and Club Darkseid. And these concepts will continue to be added more and more and more. We get the Super Young Team, which is this group of Japanese heroes that have sort of knockoff identities from the U.S. heroes that have been established for years. And someone named Sunny Sumo, and Sunny Sumo has part of the anti-life equation, and there's the anti-life equation, which is what Darkseid's been chasing after forever. Darkseid finally gets the anti-life equation, which can make all human consciousness or living consciousness submit to him under his will. This is all going on at the same time, and it is a whole lot to take in, and a lot of these concepts are just thrown at you on the fly, and they will continue to be thrown at you on the fly for the entirety of the book. Grant doesn't double back. He doesn't double back and explain. He just continues to double down on everything and say to go with it or get lost, right? So you continue to go through, and you get the new Mr. Miracle, you get Turpin continuing, Libra, you get so many things. The Alpha Lanterns, which are our lanterns, the police, the Green Lanterns, and they are corrupted. It just goes on, and Batman is captured. Lois is caught in an explosion and is near death. This is the return of Barry Allen. He's on the run from the Black Racer, which is basically the concept of death for the Flashes that can run faster than the Flashes. He's chasing after the bullet that's been fired back in time to kill Orion. It just keeps going and going. You get Frankenstein and the Agents of S.H.A.D.E. You get Overman and his and Overgirl, which are the Superman and Supergirl from a reality where the Nazis won World War II. They're all in here too. and it goes faster and faster and faster, and there's more and more and more that's happening. Hal Jordan is accused of killing Orion, but really it's Granny Goodness and one of the Alpha Lanterns. The remaining members of the Justice League, they team up, and the super young team is on the run with Mr. Miracle. And now Bloodhaven, which was where Nightwing used to patrol, was nuked during Infinite Crisis, and has continued to be a radioactive zone, right? And no one can go in. But now they're being policed by these guards that have dog horse hybrids. Oh my god. And this is all tying into Commandy, because there's a bunker in there, and Mary Marvel is here, and she's a dang ass freak now, and they're fighting, and they get captured, and oh my god, now we jump into the future, and everything's terrible, and there's red skies like the original Crisis, and Wonder Woman, and Batwoman, and Catwoman, and Giganta have been turned into the Furies, and they've been obviously possessed by the female Furies from Apocalypse, and oh my god, there's just more and more stuff happening. And then you get to this next thing, which is Superman Beyond, which is a 2-issue spin-off, which is great, but has this whole side mission. Superman is absent for a lot of this, which is part of the reason why Earth falls to Darkseid's forces, because he's not around, because Lois is near death, and he gets pulled into this whole multiversal quest by one of the monitors to save the universe from another threat. So it's not just Darkseid. Now we have Mandrak, and Mandrak is a vampire monitor. Now a vampire monitor, now you get backstory sort of drip fed to you a bit, which is that he was like the greatest monitor, and then he was corrupted by the madness of the multiverse, and he turns into a vampire, and now he wants to feed on the universes, right? Okay, easy enough. And there's multiple Supermen from other universes, including Ultraman and Shazam, or Captain Marvel, and our Superman. There's a Superman that's like Dr. Manhattan, that is also like Captain Atom. All this sort of stuff they go through. There's fighting, and there's Ultraman turns on them to be part of Mandrak's forces. All this sort of stuff. So it's not enough that there's Darkseid, right? Who's taking down the entire multiverse. But now you've got this vampire monitor that's sort of creeping in the shadows of the multiverse, that wants to take that opportunity to feed on everything. And that is this guy. You get that right there. Avoid the ring light. And the stuff he has is called the Bleed, which is sort of like the fluid between the multiverses that keep them separate. Okay, fair enough. And Superman needs to get a drop of the Bleed, and he will give it to Lois, and that will heal Lois, because she will die without his help, and he's sort of plucked out of time to go back and save everything. So if Superman is plucked out of time, then why is he missing for so much longer? It's never explained. It's just multiverse shenanigans and time travel, and there's this whole idea of this time sink that's happening around the black hole, which is a real concept that as time and space warps around a black hole, time becomes relative around that and changes, and weeks become days or hours, and that's what we're dealing with this comic. And a lot of this is just thrown at you. It's just thrown at you over and over by people. There's very little actual narration. Any sort of narration boxes are actually being told to you by one of the characters here. There's not an omniscient third-person narrator. So there's a lot of characters that are suddenly like, I'm super smart, or I've had this experience, but don't worry about it because it happened off panel. Just trust me, it happened, I swear. And now I'm going to download all my information into you. And again, it's a weak point of this comic. I would say that Grant is doing so much stuff here throughout everything and trying to push it all into these pages and these concepts that aren't being effectively given time to breathe and aren't really able to be shown in art. We'll get to that, a little bit more of that in a second. But, the good guys win for now, but Mandrake's not defeated, and Ultraman becomes a vampire Superman. cool, but this isn't going to come in until the very end of the very last issue. And if you don't read Superman Beyond, then when that happens, you're like, what's happening? Like, who is this person? Like, another thing? Like, we're just throwing another thing on there. And to be honest, outside of Superman Beyond, 6.5 of these issues have nothing to do with this. And then Grant just kind of rams it in for more effect. Lois is saved, and one of the cool things is, and this is another weird concept, is that Superman and Ultraman are turned into a gigantic rusty robot Superman to fight Mandrak, and it seems like they're going to die, and so they take the time to carve out their own tombstone, and you don't see it for most of the time, but they engrave it, and you say, what did Superman engrave? He said the only thing that could be said. And it's a cool little reveal at the end, which is that what he's saying, I guess this is reversed here, is to be continued. A cool little sentiment, right? A cool sentiment of what the idea of Superman being larger than life and always continuing, and there always to be more to come. So some of these are collected in this edition and in most of the editions, because the things that are in here are the things that are actually like pivotal to the plot, like the way that things move forward. Another one is called, like I mentioned before, Final Crisis Submit. And a lot of this has to deal with Black Lightning. There's at this point, the anti-life equation has been spread across the world through the internet, basically. And he is on the run from these people called Justifiers, and Justifiers are basically everyone that's been turned into a soldier of Darkseid. There's this helmet that gets put on them that force feeds anti-life equation into their brains. He's on the run trying to save as many people as he can, and he comes across a character called the Tattooed Man. And the Tattooed Man is a CD level, long-time DC villain. His tattoos come to life, they come off his body, and whatever they are, he controls them, like snakes or skeletons or whatever. And so he teams up with Tattooed Man to save Tattooed Man's family. And what I like about this is that it has so little of this meta-narrative bullshit that is in so much of Final Crisis. And I say that lovingly as a Grant Morrison fan, someone that has followed so much of Grant Morrison's work over time and has really enjoyed a lot of what they've done and a lot of their meta-narrative commentary, with something like, like I said before, Seven Soldiers, or Flex Mentallo, which I really love, or Doom Patrol. Like, it's always been part of Grant's overall approach to comics, is the idea of comic books and superheroes being concepts from our own brains, our own emotions that sort of embody these larger-than-life concepts that, we don't see in everyday reality, but that can inspire us and change the world. And here, it's really simple, which is that Black Lightning and Tattooed Man are forced to team up together, and it proves that the labels of superhero and supervillain don't really apply like we think. And there's this sort of interesting idea, I think, of the superhero label being a bit of a metaphor for police. And Tattooed Man's own resentment toward superheroes and the police, and sort of superheroes or the police's own preconceptions of him because of his history. But it proves that, someone labeled as a villain or a criminal is much more than that and can be a hero. Because Tattooed Man doesn't suddenly become a superhero, he's still himself, but he makes a difference. And Black Lightning ends up sacrificing himself and becoming a justifier as he's able to get Tattooed Man and his family out of there. And it has some great ideas there. It's very simple. It's just about someone being given the chance to make a difference in the world and doing that. And then Tattooed Man also takes on this equation and this circuit pattern that is able to break the anti-life equation. Again, another concept to kind of just go with it, right? But the people that find this pattern are able, they paint it on their face, which is just like Metron, the new god from the beginning of this book. and they are able to resist the anti-life equation. It's sort of it breaks its power, and later ends up being like painted on a large portion of the Earth to like break the Earth from the power too. There's a lot of interesting concepts, but again, we have about 15 different scenarios happening all at once as we continue on through this book. And the book is just jumping between everything. And it's going faster and faster. And I know that the idea is to show that, you know, the hero's forces are being overwhelmed and there's no hope. And that's sort of the general idea of the book, I would say, is this idea of finding hope in a hopeless situation, the power of hope when the entire world wants you to give up and submit, to give in, I would say. And when do people continue to choose hope, or when is that broken in them? So, for example, Turpin, this happens a lot earlier in the book, is, he's infected with Darkseid's spirit, but it's in him, and it's slowly taking over his body and sort of like decaying his body and changing him. But Turpin is still in there, and he's like unable to move. He's in, Darkseid's lair, surrounded by his minions, and everything in the world is crashing down all around him, and it kind of kills all the hope in him, and ultimately he gives up and he gives in, and that allows Darkseid to take over his body and to fully become, this evil god again. But in the end, Turpin makes the choice to totally give up, and it's an interesting idea there, because you sort of see that choice being made in everyone. And I would say overall, like, most of the heroes never give up, even when they're losing or they're defeated or they're turned. They don't really give up. They don't just like submit. Turpin is like the one major example of someone kind of giving up. And that continues. And again, there's just so much that's happening all the time as we go on. I'm thinking of at a certain point, it's kind of just this flood of moments and ideas that are happening all the time. And again, I would say that's a bit of a weakness of the book. When I read this, when it came out, I was a lot younger, obviously, and I sort of was like, the fuck's going on? Like, especially as it got deeper and deeper into the series, I was like, I can't keep up with this. Like, it was not clicking for me. And so many, because again, there's so many of these concepts that are happening that are just like thrown at you all the time. And we're just supposed to assume, yeah, of course that's happening. These characters will go on these entire journeys off page and come back and say, I've got this super secret formula that's going to save the world and blah, 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 blah. And it's sort of like, Seven Soldiers, in that book specifically broke up its team, like I was saying, into all these separate arcs, and together each of these heroes accomplished some sort of mission that they needed to do at the same time, and together beat Darkseid without really even knowing it. Here, everyone kind of knows what's going on and knows that this whole calamity is happening, and there's other heroes that are working on things, and so they're all doing their part. But again, everyone is kind of doing their own separate missions, and together they make a difference, which is cool. But because they're so separate, this is happening in another part of the universe, and this is happening here on Earth, and this is happening in Bloodhaven, this is happening in the Watchtower, and in the Hall of Justice, and all this sort of stuff. Or, Nix Wotan, this our monitor who's been turned into a human, it gets thrown in this padded cell, and is he going to be able to overcome everything and transform? And then this guy, I don't know who this is. It's never said. I'm sure that it's been said who this person is. There's this guy who solves a Rubik's Cube in one less move than is actually physically possible in reality, and therefore like helps transcend reality and create some other box. And it's like, here's another concept thrown at you real fast. And it's just, there's so much happening all the time. This is one of those books where I'm sure there's been plenty of people that have broken it down and said, I'm going to tell you everything that happens and kind of make it totally understandable if you haven't read it. I don't think there's any point to that. I don't think there's any point to saying, I'm going to walk you through every single beat of Final Crisis, and I'm going to help you understand what's this extremely complicated narrative so that you can get it and explain it to someone else, or that you never have to read this book or whatever. I would say, hopefully, if you're watching this, listening, this helps you understand it a little bit more if you've read it, or it encourages you to read it, or to just not read it. Because this is a book that has so much going on all the time and is quite the experience, for good and bad, that there's not really a point in just cramming head knowledge of this book. Because, like I said, it has no real long-lasting repercussions on most of these characters. Superman becomes a robot, but then he's fine. Wonder Woman barely has anything to do in this comic and is turned into a Fury for a while. And then she's fine. There's the only lasting death for a bit, at least, is Darkseid, which we'll get to in a second, which obviously you beat the bad guy. But Darkseid comes back, and we never really mention any of this. The only lasting effect is on Batman, because it continues into Morrison's ongoing story with Batman. So there's no point in being like, now I know everything that happened in Final Crisis, because, good for you. There's not really a point. These are stories, and Morrison makes these stories to give us, what they're trying to do is transcend the conventions of the superhero genre while also fully embracing everything about it. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And in Final Crisis, I'd say it doesn't. It doesn't work. Because all these concepts are, in a way, supposed to be metafictional, in that Superman, Grant loves this, Superman as the idea of our greatest qualities transcending reality and inspiring us in the process. Okay, sure. Darkseid as the embodiment of hopelessness and what happens when we give up hope. Okay, sure. But then we also have the miracle machine, which Superman memorizes and can grant any wish that he wants. And near the end, he sings at a perfect pitch, a perfect frequency that shatters Darkseid's essence. And, ideas of like the super young team jumps in out of nowhere and fights finally. And that's okay, sure, great. I see no real larger ideas happening there. And so many things are being thrown at you all the time that it's cool, and I'm glad that they made this. And it's an interesting example of someone taking the event comic and trying to push it to another level of concept instead of just bad guys, good guys. That if you've read most event comics, you already know the pace. We've been building something up in the background for a while. Dark forces are gathering. The heroes don't know what's coming. Maybe one or two do, and they're trying to warn everyone and get everyone prepared. And then, the bad guys strike. Whether it's right before the event comic happens or in the very early issues of the comic, they strike. And oh no, the heroes are caught off guard. And either they survive for now and escape for a bit and regroup, or they're really defeated, and then a new group of heroes has to come along for a bit. In the middle, as we hit the nadir of our story, darkness reigns and the world is in trouble, or whatever your scale of the event might be. What'll happen to the heroes? Well, a plucky resistance will come along someone maybe that you wouldn't expect, or your fan favorite character, or your symbol of hope will pick up their courage and their strength, gather a resistance, and begin to fight back. Oh, things look bad. We go back and forth for a bit. And then the tide is turned. The seemingly dead heroes are resurrected, or the captured heroes are freed. And we go into our big fight. Here's our big action climax of the second to last issue, or the beginning of the last issue. Who's going to win? Back and forth, gigantic battle. Good guys win, bad guys lose, and maybe a small portion of the universe is changed for a bit. And of course, the comic book publisher will tell you that nothing will ever be the same, right? Nothing will ever be the same, except that everything will be the same, whether it's at the end of the event or 6 months after the event, or that the next event will return us to the status quo. That's just always how it goes. And frankly, that's exactly what happens in Final Crisis, because while there are some interesting things, there's a few issues of Batman that are included in this collection too, which I've talked about before in my Batman videos, of Batman sort of under this mind control, and they're trying to copy his brain patterns to make an army, and eventually he escapes and he fights Darkseid, shoots him. That happens, but those are cool ideas. Those are some of the best stuff. I mean, to me, those Batman tie-in issues, Superman Beyond, Final Crisis Submit, those are the highlights of the entire series, and those are the tie-ins. Because everything else is just so much jammed down your throat all the time. And the fact is that it's getting jammed down your throat all the time, up until the very end. And what is the payoff? The payoff is that the good guys win and the bad guys lose. There's cool moments. Mr. Takitani, Talking Tiger, fights back and kills Kalibak, Darkseid's son, who's in tiger form, because of course he is. Cool moment, I like the Shazam family. There's also lots of artists that are used here. I'll have to give you a rundown of everyone. The pencilers are Carlos Pacheco. No, wait. The artists are J.G. Jones, Marco Rudy, Carlos Pacheco, and Doug Monkey, as doing at least pencils and also some inks. And then we also have other inkers: Jesus Marino, Christian Alamy, Tan Yuen, Drew Garassi, Norm Rapmond, Rodney Ramos, Walden Wong, and Doug Monkey to get everything done. And 3 different letterers: Rob Lay, Travis Lanham, and Rob Clark. And 3 different colorists: Alex Sinclair, Pete Patanzas, and Tony Avina. Okay. Clearly, this went over schedule and over time, and there wasn't enough time, and there was a crunch. And they needed to get this stuff out. So the art quality kind of really goes back and forth. There are cool images, obviously, like here late in the game. There's also, like, it just changes so much. Superman with Batman's body is cool, but there's so many different pencilers and inkers and artists and colorists all the time that the only reason you might not notice it at first is because just so much is happening all the time, and it's constantly changing its point of view and its direction and its location, and it just keeps going. Another thing, again, this is a larger issue that I have with Final Crisis, is that we have all these big concepts of the new gods falling, Darkseid becoming this type of singularity, pulling the Earth and the universe apparently down into like this black hole with him, and reality being crushed, time and space being crushed around him, right? Where do you see it? You don't really see it. There's some moments where the Green Lanterns are trying to get to Earth, and because everything is collapsing, they're like stuck in this like vortex, which you can kind of see at times. But it's so rarely like shown, and or major moments are crammed down into single panels. Like that's the essence of Darkseid, and he is sung to death by Superman. And then, oh, suddenly, like I said before, Mandrak is here, and we got to fight him again. Or all these Supermen, from around the multiverse are here. All these concepts. And it becomes increasingly more and more difficult for our artists, or any artist really, to take these massive concepts and condense them into like a knowable, understandable visual representation. I don't see time and space being crushed. I don't see they keep saying that the Earth is being dragged down into a black hole. You really barely ever see it. And it just keeps being said over and over by the characters. Or, for example, another thing, which is that this whole concept of the fourth world, of the new gods being in this new alternate godlike reality and all this sort of stuff, whether it's part of the main DC universe or its own universe, whatever, falls. It's fallen, it's gone, and then these gods come to Earth and they are creating the fifth world. Okay. Whatever that means, right? It's just another saying. It's a new world. And I remember hearing these rumors that what would happen in Final Crisis is that the superheroes that we know, like Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman, would ascend and become the new gods in this fifth world. And this would be the story of them transcending and becoming our newest gods. And that would be cool, but obviously that didn't happen. Whether that was an editorial thing or whether that was just a rumor that wasn't actually the case, I don't know. But it never happened, which means that the new gods are basically gone by the end, and there is no fifth world. And sort of Jack Kirby's long-standing new gods saga that never really got put to an end continues to not come to an end, and just kind of, I don't know, drifts away by the end of this. It doesn't really matter. Kind of coming to the end of the story here. Again, Darkseid's defeated, Mandrak is defeated, and everything is restored. And Nick Swoton wakes up as a human. And that sort of is the spark of Multiversity by Grant Morrison years later, which I really like. I really like Multiversity. It still has all these crazy concepts, but I would say it's much better executed than what Final Crisis is trying to be. Because, again, these concepts don't lead anywhere. They get shoved down your throat, and the comic tells you over and over that reality is collapsing and this is the last chance for the heroes, and now this new interesting concept that someone has come up with will save the day, and together they save the day. But in the end, it's just, the good guys win, the bad guys lose, and the power of hope beats the power of despair. Good beats evil, light beats dark. It's a very, very, very simplistic sort of idea at the end as we wrap it all up. And so it was interesting going back through Final Crisis and rereading it, because to me now it was very easy to understand. In general, the confusing parts are that it's all happening so fast, and every other page we're with a different character and a different concept and a different location, and it continues to happen at this rapid pace, especially maybe issue 4 on through issue 7, as things are falling apart and we're just kind of going crazy. Really, that's kind of what it came down to, was this is a lot, but it doesn't end up meaning a lot. But it is an interesting idea. Like I said, Morrison was really, really going for something big and metatextual and conceptual and spiritual here. And I think that they just overreached, like in many, many ways. Overreached in pacing, overreached in the amount of characters, overreached in the amount of concepts, and overreached in the ideas that were actually possible to put on the page. And it was, I would say, like I said before, this has no inherent value of being some sort of must-read part of the DC Universe canon, right? Then again, I don't think that most stories should have their value derived from being part of canon or not. Their value should be, is it a good story? Do you take something away from it? Does it inspire you? Whether as a person or as a creator or just, in any sort, or as a reader, is it fulfilling? Is it a fulfilling story? So I would say there is no inherent value as far as canon goes for this, really, even if you were super into canon and you're super into universes or power scaling or whatever. But does it have value as like a story, as in concepts and ideas that inspire? To me, not so much. They are interesting, and it's interesting to see how they're executed. So that alone has value, right? It's a work of art that everyone is trying really hard at. That alone gives it value. But I don't take a lot away from it. I really don't. I think that's the failing in the end of Final Crisis, is it's not greater than the sum of its parts. And there are many, many, many parts all trying to add up together. And so sorry, Grant. I didn't mean to rag on your stuff. I think I tried to give it a bit of a fair and balanced review here. Really, that's all you can really take away from it in the end, is what does it give to each person as a reader, as a person. And that's my own specific experience of rereading Final Crisis. But I want to thank you for being a patron or a member, and thank you for your support. Thanks for voting. Thanks for watching. I hope this wasn't too weird to see my voice come out of my body. But if you enjoyed this, I'm hoping to do some more on-camera stuff for member bonuses, maybe some reviews, live streams possibly. People seem to like that sometimes. So I will be doing more of that going forward in the future. Got a few little improvements to my setup that what I can do, which makes it a lot more doable now and in the future. So again, thank you, and I will see you again soon.